So today we are going to take a look at our next passage, or sorry, next text called A Passage to Africa. This will be a paper one scene text. Um, and today we'll be looking at both the sort of background and vocabulary before we kind of talk about the text in general. Now, in order for you to kind of sort of follow along, will need to suggest you to open a copy of the scene text, whether it's a soft copy or hard copy. It's up to you. In addition, I would also highly suggest you to open the textual analysis student worksheet, which you can find obviously in the A Passage to Africa folder. Now, I would suggest you to sort of work on this as I talk through the video, just so it makes it a little bit easier. So one idea is that you could, of course, have this video open on your computer, sort of fill in the blank on your iPad, or vice versa, whichever is easier. Probably the other way around. But anyway, let's begin, shall we? So let's start with the background of the text, right? So obviously the text is called Passage Africa. It's written by the author George Elegaya. Now, a little bit about our author. He is a BBC newscaster. He's quite famous, and he's covered quite a lot of different stories throughout his career. And in this particular extract, it focuses on his experience in Africa. In particular, the Somalia Civil War. Now, normally there's a bit of group discussion questions that I would kind of ask you guys to talk about, but unfortunately we're not necessarily in class, so we'll skip this ahead. Now, as many of you may or may not be familiar with, Africa is obviously quite a complex continent, right? And there's a lot of issues surrounding it. Among them, obviously, there's issues of food, technology, health, and all sorts of things. But in Somalia in particular, right, if you look at kind of this map here, Somalia is considered to be in a state of crisis or an emergency. There's a variety of sort of refugee centers throughout it, right? And part of the reason is because that Somalia has been engaged in a sort of a brutal civil war. So without going into kind of too many details, suffice to say that the sort of the civil war has created quite a large humanitarian need, and so as you can kind of see from this picture, a lot of these people end up suffering, right? Now, let's continue on. So before we look at the text, I need to talk a little bit about the sort of vocabulary you need to know. I'm going to run through this pretty quick. First off is the word hamlet. As you can kind of see, it's sort of a small human hut. Next is this term back of beyond. Now, it's sort of uncommon, but it's an idiom, but basically means sort of a very lonely place that's really far from any nearby city or town. The word ghoulish will come up. Now, I couldn't find really a good picture of a ghoul because ghouls are imaginary creatures, but basically a ghoul is a sort of a monster, right? And you can kind of see it from this picture. So someone who's described as ghoulish means that that person acts in a sort of a manner of a ghoul. So like this sort of monster that sort of creeps around and hunts for its prey. Ghost village. Ghost village just simply means a village that's pretty empty. Tramped. Now, tramped is, as you can see from this picture, basically kind of walk over things. Okay, so unfortunately, this is not necessarily the most accurate GIF of the events, but hopefully you get the idea. Tramped means you kind of walk over things. Now, in the text, we'll also talk about the word callous. Callous basically means being someone without any sympathy or feelings for others. Okay. Wild edible roots. So as you can kind of see from this background picture here, these roots in the back are edible, and so it's things that people in Africa have to resort to eating. Enervating stages of terminal hunger. Now, terminal hunger, well, first off, hunger everyone knows, but terminal means that someone who's on the cusp of death. Okay, so enervating stages of terminal hunger means that this person is sort of beyond saving, right? That he's so hungry that there's sort of no going back, right? This person is going to die because of hunger. Famine is obviously a term that means that area has a distinct lack of food, so people are starving. Festering wound. Now, I've tried to find the least graphic picture available, and this is what I found. As you can kind of see here, a festering wound is sort of any injury that's become infected and starting to get a host of bacteria and all sorts of disgusting things. A shin bone. Now, shin bone is, everyone has this. It's this sort of bone right at the front of your leg. Okay, and this will be important because we'll come across this again in the text. Gentle V shape of a boomerang. Everyone knows what a boomerang is. A gentle V shape just looks like this. Putrid. Putrid is something that is decaying and has an unpleasant smell. So often if you've ever been around sort of decaying milk, right, it'll smell pretty nasty. So that's what putrid means. Suck, the vitality. Vitality is the keyword here I want you to know. Vitality means sort of energy or strength, right? So a person who has without vitality means that a person is lacking in energy or strength. Clammy hands. So if you kind of see the hands here, it's kind of wet and kind of sticky and soggy. This will be, again, important in the text when we look at it. Okay, so just know for now, clammy hands means hands it's kind of soaked in unknown liquid. Shriveled body. Okay, so a body that's kind of aged and kind of wrinkled. A hoe is this sort of farming utensil, farming equipment, I should say. Cut to the heart. Cut to the heart is a metaphor. It's also hyperbole. It basically means that something that causes extreme amounts of pain. So if you kind of look at this GIF, Family Guy, right? He's in extreme pain. Shroud is corpse. Okay, so a shroud means to cover the body. What was it about the smile? The smile is very important. We'll take a look at it when we get there. So in the meantime, appreciate this picture of Mona Lisa, which is arguably the world's most famous smile. Also, the text will give you this quote here. Journalist observes, the subject is observed. The journalist is active, the subject is passive. The answer is pretty self-evident, but basically, right, if you kind of see from this picture here, it's almost always the journalist who is observing the person and being active, asking the questions, and it's almost always the subject here, for example, who is being watched, right? For example, the camera is watching him, and the subject is passive. He's the one, or he or she is waiting for the questions, responding to the questions, right? And so discussion. Now, again, we don't have a discussion time because, again, we're not in class, so we're going to skip ahead, and we're going to start and take a look at the text. All right, now, so let's begin. So right away, right, the text is called A Passage to Africa. Now, the title is significant, and it's significant because there's two ways you can interpret it, right? On the one hand, right, you can interpret it as a sort of meaning, right? A passage to Africa, right? It can mean like a way to Africa, right? A passage meaning sort of a road or a route, right, to Africa, right? So you can describe it like that. However, you could also interpret it as a passage to Africa as if a passage as in something written, right? For example, a letter. So if you interpret it as a passage, a letter to Africa, it could be a sort of the writer basically saying like he's writing a letter or a memoir to the country or the continents. Okay, so there's a couple ways you can interpret it. For me, I would interpret it as the writer trying to say the latter, i.e. he's trying to express his sort of feelings, right, in a letter to the continents, okay? And why does he do it? Because he experiences something very powerful, which we will take a look at later. Now, the subtitle here tells you, again, he's a very famous television reporter who covers the Somalian Civil War in the 90s. Okay, and we start looking at it. All right, now, right away, the writer starts off with a very powerful listing here, right? So, hungry, lean, scared, and betrayed faces. Okay, so 1,000 hungry, lean, scared, and betrayed faces. So this listing here is pretty evident, self-evident, right? Hungry, lean, scared, and betrayed are all negative adjectives, right? That sort of creates the impression, right, that the people here living in Somalia are suffering. Okay, they're starving, they're skinny, right? They're afraid, right? They don't know who to trust, right? So these people are in a state of suffering and struggle. Okay. So the writer starts off in the introduction. So right away he tells us, the sort of kind of haunting image, right? These people in this country are afraid. And as the writer goes on, right, he talks about he crisscrossed Somalia, so he's traveled all about. Crisscross basically means sort of kind of walking around, right? So crisscross is like walking left, kind of like that, right? Crisscross. So he's traveled all throughout Somalia from the end of 1991 to December 1992. But there's one I will never forget. So here, the writer sort of gives us already a sort of a hint, right? That there's a very powerful face, right? One in particular. What is the one referring to? The faces, right? He saw thousands of faces, but there is one that is especially powerful for our uh, for a writer, right? And so he kind of hints or foreshadows what's to come. And then he goes on, right? I was in a little hamlet just outside of Gadud, a village in the back of beyond, right? Back of beyond being middle of nowhere, a place agencies had yet to reach, so really far away. In my notebook, I jotted down instructions on how to get there. And then he tells us the instructions, right? Badali Road for a few kilometers to end up the tarmac. Tarmac is the sort of road. Turn right onto a dirt track. Stay on about 45 minutes. Go Gadud. Go another 15 minutes approximate. Like a ghost village. Now, the key thing here I'll take a look at here is this sort of line here, right? Like a ghost village. This is obviously a simile, and it gives you, again, this sort of image of the setting, right? This place is empty, it's desolate. And then we go on to the next paragraph. In the ghoulish manner of journalists on the hunt. Now, this one we again need to highlight here, ghoulish manner of journalists on the hunt. This is another technique. This one in particular is a metaphor. The writer is comparing himself to, again, like the ghoulish manner. So similar to the PowerPoint I showed you here. So he walks around like a ghoul. Now, why does he do that? Well, we'll talk about that later on. But for now, do understand that he kind of hunts. He's like this predator, right? He's like this monster who's what is he looking for? He's looking for his quote unquote prey. But in this case here, what is the prey he's hunting for? It's not necessarily humans, but rather the most striking pictures. Okay? And so who does he go with? He goes with his cameraman, and I tramped from one hut to another. Now here, we do need to point out that the writer here utilized an obvious ellipsis here. And this one is important. Why? Because when you look at it here, my cameraman, now the ellipsis creates a pause, right? My cameraman and I tramped from one hut to another. Now this pause is significant because it is at this moment that the writer realizes that he is part of this sort of group, right, of ghouls hunting around. What might have appalled us, i.e. shocked us, when we started our trip just a few days ago, no longer impressed us much. Now here we see this sort of kind of progression, right? The writer is very blunt and honest in telling us that, what shocked him a couple of days ago now doesn't even, he doesn't even bend. He's no longer shocked or impressed by what he's seen. Okay, so this tells us that the writer here, he's becoming sort of desensitized, right? Desensitized. Okay, he's sort of become desensitized to this image of suffering and pain and etc. Okay, and then he goes on, right? The search for the shocking is like the craving for a drug. Okay, now this is obviously again a simile, right? An obvious use of simile here, and this simile here is like the craving for drugs, right? You require heavier and more frequent doses the longer you're at it. So here he compares his experience of searching for these shocking or striking pictures to a drug addict, right? A drug addict who needs more more powerful drugs, right? So again, the writer takes a sort of a negative approach when how he views himself. He isn't just a photographer, rather he's an addict, right? He's looking for the next quote unquote high. But in this case here, his high is the most powerful or striking pictures. This again highlights the fact that he's sort of kind of desensitized to all this, right? He's sort of immune, to what he's already seen. He needs more and more and more suffering. But the thing is, when you think about it, right, what sort of message does that create? Is that really a positive thing, right? When a journalist is looking for the next big, shocking story, right? So he doesn't care, no longer cares about the small little stories. He needs to look for something even more extreme, right? So again, this sort of desensitization, he likens to that of a sort of being like a drug addict, right? And again, this creates a sort of a negative stigma, right, or perception that he creates for himself. The pictures that stun the editors one day are written off as the same old stuff the next. So again, desensitization. This sounds callous, but it's just a fact of life. Now here, the writer, you'll notice, he utilizes a very distinct, a very blunt tone, right? This sounds callous, but it's just a fact of life. Now, what makes this really shocking, though, is that do remember, right? Who is he? He is a television reporter. Now, again, it's very unusual for us as an audience to see this particular side of a television reporter. We normally see television reporters who just simply, stand in front of the TV and report the facts. But here, he is sharing his very brutal and honest and blunt opinion of things. And this is very shocking to us as a reader. It's how we collect and compile the images that so move people in the comfort of their sitting rooms back home. So he tells us here that his goal is again to sort of shock the people, right? Who are the people, i.e. us, okay, to shock us who are sitting very comfortably in our home, sort of like you watching this video. And now, after these first couple of paragraphs here, the writer starts to go on to give us a couple anecdotes, right? A couple experiences he has with some of the locals. And the first one he talks about here is Amina Abdurrahman. And he talks about her experience, right? Who had gone on that morning in search of wild edible roots, right? Searching for food, right? Leaving her two young girls on the dirt floor of their hut. So obviously they don't live in, extravagance. They live in a fairly poor setting. They had been sick for days and were reaching the final enervating stages of terminal hunger. Now, again, this line here tells us that these kids are sadly dying, right? And what are they dying of? They're dying of starvation, right? They're already at the stage of terminal hunger, right? They can no longer be sort of cured. And here he talks about a little bit more, right? Habiba was 10 years old and her sister Ayan was 9. By the time Amina returned, she had only one daughter. Habiba had died. Now here, we see the writer utilize, obviously here, Habiba died, a short sentence, right? This sort of reflects the sort of abruptness, right? The passing is happening in an instant, right? In the snap of the fingers. And then we keep on. He links this, right? No rage, no whimpering. This is again, a usage of language technique. This one is anaphora. Now, what's the significance here? No rage, no whimpering. What does that mean? It's as if these people didn't make a sound, right? There's no angry, no rage, right? There's no complaining. Why did she die, right? Or no whimpering, right? No crying, no tears, no suffering. So it's very strange, right? Because basically this anaphora tells us that there was sort of no emotion, right, over the passing of someone. And not just anyone. This is her daughter, right? She dies and there's no emotions. Why? Just the passing away. That simple, frictionless, motionless deliverance from a state of half-life to death itself. Now, why was there no emotion to this, right? The hint here, you can see, is from this line here. Simple, frictionless, motionless deliverance. This obviously is a triplet, but notice here, it's simple, frictionless, right? So it's like something smooth and motionless, right? There's no motion. Now, why are these three words significant? Why is this triplet important? It's because these three things, right? It hints at the fact that there is no struggle. Oftentimes, when people are dying, right? People, as a natural reaction, we tend to sort of struggle against death, right? We don't want to die. We don't want our loved ones to die. We want them to fight, right? To struggle, to move, right? To fight off death. But here, the writer's triplet tells us that rather than fight against death, it sort of comes there's no resistance, right? There's no friction, right? There's no struggle, there's no movement, right? And why is it? It's because these people are, for example, here, Ayan, right? They were living in a state of half life, meaning they weren't even living, she wasn't living a full life. Rather, she was living half a life, right? Why? Because she was struggling, right? There was no food. She's hungry every day, right? She's sick, right? That's not sort of a life to live, right? So for these people, right, this description tells us that the writer, or sorry, these peoples view death as a sort of almost like a deliverance, right? As if they were delivered, freed from, the struggles of living. Like that life in the sort of the state is not any sort of place, to enjoy. Rather, it's a sort of a punishment that these people are being freed from the punishment of life in a way. Not to mention, no rage, no whimpering, the lack of emotion. You could also explain it as the writer, or sorry, the mom, Amina, sort of being desensitized to death, right? That perhaps there's so much death around this country that she's used to it, right? And that she barely reacts to her own daughter's death. And then the writer goes on, it was, as I said at the time of my dispatch, a vision of famine, away from the headlines, a famine of quiet suffering and lonely death. So here we get our next language technique here. Famine of quiet suffering and lonely death. Okay, so here again, it's the writer utilizes sort of a mode of language that conveys this, that these people, die lonely, right, and die sort of without anyone supporting them or around them, right? Which it creates a sort of pathos, right, for us, right? As a reader, we sort of feel sad, right, that that this is sort of the quote unquote life they live. And then the writer goes on. There was an old woman lay in her hut. So here we get the second anecdote, right? Abandoned by relations who were too weak to carry her on their journey to find food. So this old lady is abandoned, right? It's quite sad, right? She's left alone to die alone, right? It was the smell that drew me to her doorway, the smell of decaying flesh. So here we get this sort of olfactory imagery, right? The imagery of scent, right? The smell of decaying flesh. Now, if you've ever smelled anything rotten, right? Something that's decaying, it is a terrible smell, one that no one would ever appreciate, or generally most people don't appreciate or would like, right? So this smell is absolutely disgusting. And why is her decaying flesh here? Well, he continues, right? Where her shin bone. Remember where the shin bone was, right? The shin bone was, actually, oddly enough, in this picture here. That's the shin bone, or this is the shin bone, right? What happened to her shin bone? There was a festering wound the size of my hand, right? So you can kind of imagine, right? The festering wound looks a bit like this, right? It's gigantic, it's huge, it's it's right at where her shin bone is, and that obviously creates a sense of like disgust, right? You're quite disgusted by what you've seen. But not only that, why is it there, right? Well, she'd been shot in the leg as the retreating army of the deposed dictator. Deposed meaning overthrown. So the obviously dictator is someone who's a third authoritarian ruler who's often rules with an iron fist, right? Again, usage of ellipsis. Took revenge on whoever it found on its way. So this ellipsis here creates a pause, right? And this pause reflects the writer's sort of kind of pity, right? Because here, this woman basically is an innocent old lady who was shot simply because the army was angry, right? And they just shot this lady in the leg for no reason, just because they were angry, for revenge. The shattered leg had fused into the gentle V shape of a boomerang. Now, remember the picture of that boomerang I showed you, right? This boomerang here, well, imagine your shin bone, this leg, is now, in this case here, it's become a boomerang. So the shin bone is warped. The angle is curved, right? That's obviously not how your shin bone should be. Your shin bone should obviously be straight. But here, it's curved, it's twisted, right? And this is important because, again, it creates this sort of disgust, right? You're sort of you feel repulsed by this image, right? The gentle V shape of a boomerang. One thing I do want to put note here is that there's sort of also a juxtaposition, right? The gentle V shape. So gentle, right, implies that it's sort of kind of natural, it's sort of light and delicate. But the fact that it's used to describe a shin bone, again, sort of exaggerates or highlights that disgust, right? That's because you realize it's not what the shin bone should be. And then we get to the next line here. It was rotting, she was rotting, right? So we've got this very simple repetition here telling us that not only was her leg rotting, but our person, this old lady, right? She was rotting too, right? And so you can kind of, again, feel this really disgusting imagery of the scene. You could see her in her sick yellow eyes and smell it in the putrid air she recycled with every struggling breath she took. So it tells you here, the writer, that she's not living any good life. Rather, she's struggling to breathe. She's sick, right? And she's breathing out putrid air, right? The air that is disgusting. And here we get our next line, and this one's a very important one. And then there was the face I will never forget. So here we get the usage of particular use of structure. The writer uses a single sentence paragraph, right? That's important because here he tells us that here is a very powerful moment for him. And if you were kind of clever, if you remember, right, why is this important? Well, do you remember at the very beginning, right? But there's one I will never forget. Well, earlier there's a sort of small foreshadowing. Well, now this is that foreshadowing coming into reality. My reaction to everyone else I met that day was a mixture of pity and revulsion. Yes, revulsion. So here, the writer uses a very unique technique, right? He tells you, or more importantly, he admits to his reaction, right? Now, again, notice that it tells us my reaction to everyone that met that day was a mixture of pity and revulsion. Now, first off, let's take a look at pity and revulsion first. This wording is important, again, because you have to remember his job is that of a television reporter. And here he is saying, the people I met that day, well, they disgusted me, right? I pitied them. I was repulsed by them. These people were disgusting. But the thing is, again, that's not a normal sort of sentence that we would expect from a reporter, right? And the writer knows this too, which is why he says this next line, right? Yes, revulsion. This here is basically the writer admitting, right? And he's sort of anticipating the reader's sense of shock. He knows we are shocked, right? And so he has to reassure us, even though he cannot see or read our reaction, he's responding to it, right? So in this case here, the writer is sort of preemptively responding to this, to our reaction, right? Preemptively, right? Responding to it. Now this here is also a technique, right? Here he's almost directly talking to us. Now this one is a technique what we call authorial intrusion. You'll see this in the worksheet, so if you're not sure how to spell it, look at the worksheet, it'll tell you. But basically, again, the writer is responding to us preemptively, right? Even before he knows, or even though he cannot see our reaction, he reaffirms the fact that yes, he was disgusted by these people. The degeneration of the human body, sucked of its natural vitality by the twin evils of hunger and disease. Here, the writer utilizes sucked of the vitality of its natural vitality by twin evils of hunger and disease. Twin evils of hunger and disease is a clear, obvious use of personification, right? Is a disgusting thing. We never say so in our TV reports. It's a taboo that has yet to be breached. Now here, he tells us, sort of tells us the facts, right? The reason why us as an audience that we never see the reporters or the journalists' own opinions is because that it is typically taboo, right? It's something that the journalists, in order to be a professional journalist, they have to refrain, right, from sharing their own personal opinions. And yet here he is in this writing telling all of us his personal opinions. To be in a feeding center is to hear and smell the excretion of fluids by people who are beyond controlling their bodily functions. So here we have another sort of technique here, right? Um, to be in a feeding center is to hear and smell the excretion of fluids. So first off, feeding center, okay, so think of it as a place to eat. Imagine it as a sort of like a food court, but obviously not a food court. In innate places is where there are tables or where they eat, right? But the thing is, it's not just a place for eating. Because while you're eating, you're hearing and smelling the excretion of fluids by people who are beyond controlling their bodily functions. So excretion of fluids is, if you know your biology, is basically a better way of saying people were peeing and pooing and having diarrhea and vomiting and spitting and coughing and all over the place, right? And it's not just the fluids. It's not just the hearing of it, right? It's the smell as well. So if you can imagine, right? Imagine if you're in a place you're eating and people all around you are vomiting and throwing up and peeing and pooing all around you, and there's a smell and you can hear it all around you. You would feel, what would you feel, right? Obviously disgusted. So here there's a very strong sort of imagery in this setting, right? We feel kind of repulsed and disgusted by this. To be in a feeding center is to surreptitiously, i.e. secretly, to wipe your hands on the back of your trousers after you've held the clammy palm of a mother who had just cleaned the vomit from her child's mouth. So here, first off, why is the writer surreptitiously wiping his hands? Well, why is he secretly wiping his hands? Simply because after shaking hands with a sweaty palm, do you remember what is a clammy palm here? Clammy palm is like this, right? It's kind of soaked, it's wet, right? But the thing is, in this case, why is it clammy? Well, because this mother, right? She's only just cleaned the vomit from her child's mouth. So her child vomited. She cleaned it, and then she shook our journalist's hand. So you can't really fault him, right? That he would want to wipe the back of his trousers, right? Because if you imagine shaking the hands of someone who's just vomited into his hands, right, you'd probably be pretty disgusted. But notice here that he's kind of secretly wiping it because he obviously doesn't want to offend that person. But the thing is, our writer, he tells us that he's not just disgusted by these people, though. He also pities them. He tells us, right? He tells us right here, right? Pretty obvious, right? There's pity too, right? He pities them. Because even in this state of utter despair, they aspire to a dignity that is almost impossible to achieve. So here, why does he pity these people? Is that even though these people are suffering, right? They're in a state of utter despair. There's no hope. They still strive. They aim for dignity, right? They want to have some pride in themselves, right? That feels almost impossible to achieve. So here, that sort of appreciation for these people, right, is valid. Right? Because even though these people have nothing, right, and they're suffering, yet they still try to have some sort of dignity and pride in who they are. Okay, and there is there's some truth and power to that, right? Just because people are poor, suffering, and they struggle, doesn't mean that these people should give up, right? They still aim to fight for something better, and there is sort of an a quality to that. And then we go on next one, right? An old woman will cover her shriveled body with a soiled cloth as your gaze turns towards her. So here we see the first example of dignity, right? So why is she covering her shriveled body? Well, she doesn't want our journalists to see her, right, in this sort of weakened state. So she takes this soiled cloth, right, this blanket, right, and she covers herself as our gaze turns toward us, as we look toward her, right? So here she wants to preserve that little bit of dignity she had, right? And she doesn't want to show her sort of dying, her starving body to someone else. Or the old and dying man who keeps his hoe next to the mat, from which one day soon they will shroud his corpse, as if he means to go until the soil once all this is over. So again, here our journalist takes pity on this other old man, right, who's dying, right? But he keeps his hoe, right, his farming utensil, right, or equipment, right, next to him. And why is there a sort of pride to that? Well, it's sort of pride to it because because here, right, this man feels like he doesn't want to have, you know, he doesn't want to rely purely, not to say rely, but this man, it's as if this man plans to keep on working, right? Even though he's dying, right? And he's near death because he tells us they will shroud his corpse. So this man is on the verge of death, yet he still keeps his farming equipment next to him, right? As if, you know, he takes pride in his work. I saw, sorry, I saw that face for only a few seconds, a fleeting meeting of eyes. So here we finally get to the sort of the climax of the text, right? The high point. A fleeting meeting of eyes. Fleeting basically means this very brief moment, right? That eyes see each other. As its owner retreated into the darkness of another hut. In those brief moments, there had been a smile. But not from me, but from the face. It was not a smile of greeting. It was not a smile of joy. How could it be? But it was a smile nonetheless. So here, the writer uses he's uses a sort of rhetorical question right here, right? And why is he using this rhetorical question? Well, very simple, right? The writer sees this man smiling, right? But it was not a smile you used to greet someone, nor was it a smile of happiness, but it was a smile that he could not explain. It moved me in a way that went beyond pity or revulsion. So here, the writer uses a rhetorical question very simply to sort of highlight, right, exaggerate, right, that it was obviously not a smile of joy, right, because these people are starving, they're dying, obviously they cannot smile for happiness. Yet this man still smiled nonetheless. Why, right? And this moved me in a way. And then he goes on, right? What was it about that smile? So obviously here, this smile, which is repeated, right, carries a very powerful significance to this writer, right? He needs to find out, right? He's a reporter, right? He had to find out, why was this man smiling? I urged my translator to ask the man why he had smiled. He came back with an answer. It's just that he was embarrassed to be found in this condition, the translator explained. And then it clicked. Now here, and then it clicked. Now, this line here is another short sentence, and this one is very important because here, this signifies that moment of realization, right? That moment of epiphany the reporter had, the journalist had, on why the man smiled. That's what the smile had been about. It was the feeble, i.e. weak, smile that goes with an apology, the kind of smile you might give if you felt you had done something wrong. So now we find out why that old man was smiling. And it was because he felt like he had done something wrong, okay? What had he done wrong? Well, very straightforward, right? He was sort of poor and dying, right? And that's why he felt sad, right? That he felt he wanted to almost sort of apologize that, our journalist had seen him in such a state. Normally inured, right? Inured meaning hardened, right? Normally inured, hardened to stories of suffering, accustomed or gotten used to the evidence of deprivation, right? When you have no food, no medicine, right? I was unsettled by this one smile in a way I had never been before. Now the writer here, the writer here, let me sort of highlight this, right? This is a very powerful line, right? And this sort of contrast kind of highlights really something a bit ironic almost, because here it tells you that our journalist, right, he's normally used to hearing about suffering, right? He's used to seeing starving people and dying bodies and so forth. He's used to all that, but yet here he was unsettled, meaning sort of moved, right, shocked, right, felt uncomfortable, right, by a smile in a way I'd never been before. So it's sort of ironic because normally as people, right, when we see a picture of suffering, of people dying, right, we would feel unsettled, right? And yet yet for him, it's a smile that unsettles him, right? A smile is something that we see almost every day, right? So again, this sort of line tells us this sort of the impact the smile has onto the sort of desensitized person, right? So here are the lines sort of here, right? This line here tells us that he sort of desensitized us, and yet the smile still had an impact on him, right? Or despite of it. There was an unwritten code between journalists and the subject in these situations. The journalist observes, the subject observes, the journalist active, subject passive. So again, he tells us here that it's the general rule, right? Always the journalist asking the questions, observing. But this smile had turned the tables on that tacit agreement. Tacit means unspoken. So, i.e., suddenly, no longer is it that the journalist is active and the subject is passive. Rather, the roles are suddenly become reversed, right? It is now this person who is observing our journalist, right? This person is the one asking the question, right? And here's our journalist is the one responding to it. Suddenly, the whole arrangement is flipped upside down, right? Everything is suddenly changed upside down. Without uttering a single word, the man had posed a question that cut to the heart of the relationship between me and him. And here's the thing, again, the power of that smile, right? The thing is, through that one smile, the man didn't even have to say a word, and yet, through that smile, the man managed to create a question for our journalist, right? And this question cut to the heart of the relationship between me and him. Cut to the heart is a metaphor. It basically means something that causes sort of immense pain, right? And what is that question here? Right here, it says the question sort of questions, right, the relationship between the journalist and the person, between us, i.e. the readers and these people, the subjects, and also between the rich world and the poor world, right? How everyone sort of interacts with one another. If he was embarrassed to be found weakened by hunger and ground down by conflict, how should I feel to be standing there so strong and confident? And here, this is the power of that smile. It has made our writer really question, right? Really question, who in this situation, who should be the one ashamed, right? Because here, the man gave a smile because he was ashamed of being poor and dying, right? And yet, our writer realizes that, however, it's not the man that should be embarrassed, right? Who's weakened by hunger, and ground down by conflict. Rather, it should be him, the journalist, or us, as people who are well off, right, or much better off, should be embarrassed, to be the ones standing there, looking at them, being strong and confident, right? We should be the ones ashamed of the situation, of judging these people, right? Of taking advantage of their suffering to find the next biggest news, right? We should be ashamed of ourselves that we're not doing more to help these people, right? Rather than taking advantage of them for the next biggest story. And so now we get to the final conclusion of the extract, which here tells us, finally, right, what's he going to do? Well, here he says, I resolved there and then that I would write a story of Gufgadud with all the power and purpose I could muster. The diction here, right? Power and purpose, right? And with all the power and purpose, all right, tells us that our writer has found a newfound determination, right? He's going to use all his energy, all his efforts, right? He could do to write a story about the city, to tell the world of what's happening, right? It seemed at the time, and still does, the only adequate answer a reporter can give to the man's question. So, i.e., based on what the man asked, right, without a single word, right, what is he going to do? What are you going to do about it? Well, in this case here, he's going to write a story and tell the world about it, right, and try to help these people. And finally, go to the last, our ending, right? And the ending is a very powerful one, because here you'll notice he says this line: I have one regret about that brief encounter in Gufgadud. Having searched through my notes and studied this dispatch from the BBC broadcast, I see that I never found out what the man's name was. Yet meeting him was a seminal moment, seminal meaning a very powerful moment, in the gradual collection of experiences we call context. right? So here the writer tells us that, meeting him gave him context, right? Through meeting this man, he now understood the situation, right? More than just facts and figures, right? These are easy parts, right? It's easy to see that on the news, 100 people died, 1,000 people are starving, or what have you. But rather now he sees this face, this man, right? It puts a person to the experience, right? He's no longer just another starving man or woman. Rather, it's John, it's Tim, it's Bob, right? It's someone who's starving, right? It's a person to this. Knowing where they sit in the grand scheme of things, it's much harder. So, i.e., this line basically tells us it's much harder to look at the big picture rather than individual story. And the writer ends with this particular line here. So, my nameless friend, if you are still alive, I owe you one. Now, notice here the writer uses a particular usage of structure. Notice that here he says, if you are still alive, I owe you one. This here is the writer using second person perspective, and he's talking, right? He's almost as if he's talking directly to this, to the subject, right? The man he doesn't know the name of, okay? And he sort of apologizes to him directly. And it's a very powerful technique. Now, I will end this off with one last note here, which is the significance, right, of the name. Why does our protagonist want to know the man's name so much, right? Why does he care? Well, think about it, right? All the people you care about, right? Do you just, how do you refer to them? You don't say, oh, my I say, okay, so say your best friend, right? You wouldn't just say, hey best friend, or hey you, or hey number 220 friend, or whatever, right? You want to call her by her name, right? Hey Jennifer, or hey Samantha, or hey whatever, right? A name carries this sort of human element to it, right? There's a sort of humanity and sort of I guess you could say kind of personalization, I guess you could say, right? To it, right? It makes this man become someone rather than a face, right? Because a face, do remember at the start of the text here, the writer refers to them as sort of faces, right? It's sort of decontextualized, it's depersonalized. They're just, not necessarily people, they're just faces, right? They're just, things you see. It's no different from that of a piece of paper, right? But now, right? Now our writer wants to know his name. He wants to know who he is, right? And that is very, very, very powerful because this signifies that our journalist, through this experience with this smile, he is now transformed, right? He's sort of, our journalist is sort of transformed. He's no longer this sort of, desensitized, he's no longer desensitized, right? He's no longer desensitized. Rather, he's become rather a person, right? He's become someone, he's become a human, a person once more. So he's turned from this to this, and all through that one smile. And because of that, right, he only wish he had knew this name was, because that man's smile has changed his life and sort of his perspective on things. So anyway, that's, hopefully you made it through. Don't worry if you had to take pauses. I had to take pauses as well, but that kind of explains our text today. So now that I've talked through it, your next task here is to open the worksheet here, and I want you to sort of fill out the blanks and submit the copy. I will be creating a folder for you to submit the soft copies. Make sure you submit it there. The deadline will be next Monday. That should give you plenty of time to finish. And good luck. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, that's it for the day. Hope you learned a lot. Thank you for listening.